There is a strange exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from explaining yourself too often, from constantly clarifying your intentions, from justifying your choices, from defending your silence, your pace, your boundaries, your dreams. It is the tiredness of living under a spotlight you never asked for, answering questions no one has the right to ask, rehearsing reasons for a life that already makes sense to you but somehow never seems to make sense to others. At first, you think this exhaustion means you're misunderstood. Later, you begin to suspect something else, that the more you explain yourself, the less grounded you feel. That every explanation pulls you further away from something quiet but essential inside you. And one day, almost without warning, a realization begins to surface, slow, unsettling, and freeing at the same time. The people who seem most at peace rarely explain themselves at all. They don't announce who they are. They don't justify why they choose what they choose. They don't argue to be seen, heard, or validated, not because they don't care, but because they already know. And the more a person knows himself, the less he feels the need to explain himself to the world. Most of us begin life doing the opposite. We explain ourselves constantly. We explain why we're quiet, why we're ambitious, why we changed our minds. Why we stayed, why we left, why we're not ready. Why we are. We learn early that explanation is a form of safety. That if people understand us, they won't judge us. That if we speak clearly enough, carefully enough, politely enough, the world will grant us permission to exist as we are. So we explain too. Parents who worry. To teachers who question. To friends who compare. To strangers who assume. To social media feeds that silently demand coherence, productivity, clarity, proof. And slowly, explanation becomes habit, then reflex, then identity. You stop asking, "Is this true to me?" and start asking, "How will this look?" You don't choose your words to express yourself, you choose them to defend yourself, to preempt misunderstanding, to soften judgment, to control perception. Without realizing it, you begin living a life narrated outward instead of anchored inward. The invisible cost of explaining. At first, explaining yourself feels reasonable, even mature. You think it's communication. You think it's transparency. You think it's kindness, but over time, something subtle happens. Each explanation chips away at certainty. Each justification introduces doubt. Each defense invites interrogation. The more you explain, the more questions you attract. The more you clarify, the more people feel entitled to your reasons. And suddenly, your life is no longer yours alone. It becomes a public draft, open for revision, commentary, and approval. You begin to feel like a witness in your own life instead of its author. What's worse is that explanation trains you to distrust your own knowing. If you constantly need to explain yourself, you begin to believe that your choices are incomplete without external agreement, that your inner compass requires public validation to function, and that belief is exhausting because the world is never satisfied. There is always another question. Another opinion. Another interpretation. And no matter how clearly you explain yourself, someone will misunderstand you anyway. We rarely explain ourselves because we are confident. We explain ourselves because we are afraid of being misjudged, afraid of being excluded, afraid of being seen as wrong, selfish, weak, strange, slow, or difficult. Explanation becomes armor, a way to soften the blow before it arrives, a way to say, "Please don't hurt me, I can make sense if you listen long enough." But here is the uncomfortable truth. The need to explain often has very little to do with communication, and everything to do with insecurity. Not loud insecurity, quiet insecurity, the kind that hides behind politeness, oversharing, and emotional labor, the kind that says, "If I don't explain myself, they might think badly of me, and that would mean something about who I am." And so, we explain even when no one asked, even when silence would be enough, even when the explanation costs us peace. The shift toward knowing yourself doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It doesn't arrive with applause or clarity. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, when you notice that explaining yourself no longer brings relief. You explain and still feel misunderstood. You clarify and still feel judged, you justify, and still feel empty. At some point, a question surfaces not loudly, but persistently. Why am I doing this? Why am I carrying the burden of being understood by everyone? Why does disagreement feel like a personal failure? Why does my sense of self collapse so easily under someone else's opinion? That question is the doorway. The turning point comes when you realize something deeply unsettling but liberating. Most people are not confused by you, they are projecting onto you. They don't want explanations, they want reassurance that your choices align with their worldview, that your pace doesn't threaten theirs, that your silence doesn't judge their noise, that your boundaries don't expose their lack of them. Once you see this, the urgency to explain fades because you understand that no explanation can fix a projection. No justification can dissolve insecurity that isn't yours. No clarity can satisfy someone who isn't listening, and more importantly, you begin to understand yourself, not intellectually, not philosophically, but viscerally. You start noticing patterns. What drains you? What grounds you? What you do when no one is watching. What feels true even when it's inconvenient, and that knowing changes how you move through the world. Knowing yourself is not about having a perfect self-concept. It's not about confidence in the loud sense. It's about familiarity. It's about recognizing your rhythms, your limits. Your values, your contradictions. It's knowing what you can carry and what you can't, what you care about, and what you've been pretending to care about. What matters to you even if it makes no sense to others. When you know yourself, explanations lose urgency because you are no longer negotiating your identity in real time. You stop performing coherence. You stop narrating your choices. You stop translating your inner world for external comfort, not because you are cold, but because you are clear. Silence changes when it comes from self-knowledge. Before, silence felt dangerous, like absence, avoidance, or weakness. Now, silence feels grounded, intentional, complete. You realize that not everything needs to be said. Not everyone needs to understand. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Some things are true even when unspoken, and that realization is powerful because the less you explain yourself, the more energy you reclaim, the more presence you regain, the more aligned you feel. Silence becomes a form of self-respect. The more a person knows himself, the less he feels the need to explain himself to the world, not because the world doesn't matter, but because the self no longer depends on it. Explanation is often a substitute for self-trust. Silence, when rooted in understanding, is evidence of it. You don't stop communicating, you stop over-communicating, you stop apologizing for being who you are, you stop negotiating your existence, and in that space, something rare happens. You feel at home in yourself. So ask yourself gently, honestly, where am I explaining myself out of fear instead of clarity? Who am I trying to convince? What part of me am I still outsourcing for approval? Practice knowing yourself before presenting yourself. Practice listening inward before speaking outward. Practice letting your life be the explanation, because the people who need explanations will never be satisfied. But the moment you know who you are, you won't need to convince anyone, and that quiet freedom, that unspoken certainty, is where real peace begins.